Welcome friends, I'm Sarah with Cleopatra's Crochet. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you my favorite pattern for knitting a baby blanket. Once you get it started and make the first border, then from there you use a couple stitch markers and just read your knitting, and it's really mindless. You don't have to count stitches or anything once you get going. For this project, you're going to need several things. I am using these Blossom Cakes yarn, and I went ahead and bought 3 of them. 2, you're going to play a little bit of yarn chicken, depends on your stitches and how big you want the blanket to be. I have done that before. For my own peace of mind, I got 3 cakes this time, so I know that I have plenty. You're also going to need connected knitting needles. I went ahead and got 40-inch knitting needles, and these are US size 6 or 4 millimeter. The yarn does call for 5 millimeter or US size 8. These are the needles I have. It just means my stitches will be a little bit tighter. Hence, I might use up a little bit more yarn, and I got 3 cakes instead of just 2 to make sure that I had enough. I'm also going to use these little needle stoppers because you can go ahead and put your project down and you're not going to have it fall off of the needles. I highly recommend these. They're not required, but I highly recommend them. You're also going to need several stitch markers, a tapestry needle for the end when you want to go ahead and weave in the ends, or when you need to join from one yarn cake to the other, and then some scissors. To get started, I want you to go ahead and cast onto your knitting needles until they're basically covered. The reason for that is I want a blanket that's in the receiving blanket size, and the 2 common dimensions for that are either 36 by 36 inches or 40 by 40. These needles are 40 inches long. So if I've cast on until they're mostly covered, I'm going to get something in the range of 36 inches to 40 inches. Because once you start knitting, this cast on is going to expand a little bit. Now, to make sure that the pattern works out, I'm going to do a little bit of math, but I'll walk you through it. I've gone ahead and counted these stitches, and in between my stitch markers are 50. So for this yarn, for my cast on, I've got 150 inches, or sorry, 150 stitches cast onto my needles. Now that doesn't divide evenly. My plan is a blanket that has a border, and then is a weave knit with 8-inch or with 8 sections. I'm going to show you this. Okay, so for the border, I'm going to do 20 stitches and 20 stitches. And then if I want 8 sections in here, I need an even number of stitches multiplied by 8. And if I take 150 stitches, which is what I have cast onto my needles right now, and I subtract 40, that leaves me with 110. 110 does not divide into 8 evenly. If I go to 152 stitches minus the 40, then I'll get 112, and that will divide evenly into 8. So if we take 112 divided by 8, you're going to get 14, which means that each of these 8 squares are going to have 14 stitches in them. I like that math. I have my border is going to be a little bit wider than each of my quadrants, and I'm going to have a border on each side, and it's going to be a perfect square because I'll just do enough rows until my gauge works into a square. We'll figure out the rows later. I'll show you that. But for now, I need 20 stitches on each side for the border, and I need 14 stitches times 8 for the inside. So I need 152 stitches. I have 150, so I'm just going to add 2 more stitches on. Now that I have the correct number of stitches cast on to my needles, I am going to do the seed stitch for the border of the blanket. That is a 2-row repeat. Essentially just do knit, purl all the way across your row. And then you're going to shift it by 1 and repeat that on the second row. And since I want to do it for the border, and I want the border to be a perfect square, I have 20 stitches allotted for the border. Now, theoretically, you should do 20 rows to have 20 stitches by 20 rows be a perfect square. A lot of times that doesn't work out perfectly, so go ahead and do somewhere around 20 rows, and then you need to check as you get further along to see how many rows you actually need. And that's just going to vary. I've made this blanket several times, and it's always slightly different. It just depends on you and your needles and the yarn. So make it flexible, do somewhere around 20 rows. Maybe it's, 17 rows, maybe it's 22 rows. But just know as you approach the point where you've got 20 rows completed of the seed stitch, you need to stop and start measuring just with your hands, just a quick little check to see if your length is going to equal your height. So I'm going to go ahead and make progress because there's a lot of knitting to do off camera, and I will meet you close to that point so I can show you what I'm talking about. But just go ahead and do a bunch of rows of seed stitch, and I will meet you further on in the project. As you can see, we're further on in the project, and I've completed many rows of the seed stitch. Our original plan was to do 20 stitches for all of the border and then switch doing 14 stitches on the inside for the basket weave pattern. However, I've gotten this far, and my check for making sure that I have an even border on the vertical parts and an even border on the horizontal parts is to make sure that the width is exactly the same as the length. I like this size of a border, and when I count the stitches, so 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, if I go out to the 20, 16, 18, 19, 20, that's a bit larger of a border than I personally was envisioning. So I'm going to make an adjustment here. Instead of doing, and you can adjust by 8 stitches total, because if you have 8 quadrants in here, you need an even number of stitches. You can't have like 14 stitches in this column and then 15 in this one. It'll make the blanket look uneven. So instead, if I take away 4 stitches from each end, 4 and 4 makes 8, and I put 16 stitches on the borders, and then I distribute, so I've got 8 stitches to distribute. That means I will instead have 15 stitches in each of the 8 quadrants of the basket weave. I'll have nice even numbers, and I'm still working with the original 152 stitches. So that's where that adjustment is coming. Just a reminder, I want 16 stitches now because I personally didn't want this large of a border. I like the look of this large of a border instead. You can stick with the original. You can still do 20 stitches on the border and do 14 stitches on each of the inside ones. That's fine. The math works out. I'm just walking you through this adjustment because I frequently adjust this pattern every time I make it because your tension can be slightly different. The yarn can be slightly different. And I want you to understand the foundation of it and be able to make those adjustments because I think knitting should be flexible. So we still have 152 stitches total. I want 16 stitches for the border on each side, and I want 15 stitches for each section. Now, this is where you're going to set it and forget it. I want you to put a stitch marker. I've counted out 16 stitches and I've put a stitch marker. So continuing from here on out, I'm going to make seed stitch on either end, on this end and on this end of each of my rows. Then count out 15 stitches, put a stitch marker. 15 stitches, put a stitch marker. All the way around until you get all of your stitch markers in place. Double check. I have border. Then I have 1 section, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then I have border again. Now, every time you hit a stitch marker, you're changing. I'm going to leave these stitch markers in until I get to the end of the blanket. I'm going to make seed stitch here. I'm going to knit. I'm going to purl. And I'm going to alternate knit, purl. So all of these stitches are knit, all of these stitches are purl. And then I continue that. And this is where you need to be able to read your knitting, because when you reverse it, so this will be a knit when I first make this row, but when I flip it and come back the other direction, it's going to be a purl. So I'm going to go ahead and make that first row, and then I'll show you how to read your stitches. But I just wanted to show you first how to set up your work with all of the stitch markers. And then I'll put on my first row and I'll show you what I'm talking about. And then once you've done the first row, you're just reading your work and you're making squares. So all the time, you're just gonna look at your length. And this is where I'm not even measuring with a measuring tape. I'm literally just doing a gauge with my fingers. My length is equal to my width or my height. And when you make that measurement, don't measure to the edge of the needle, measure to this side of the needle. So I'm measuring from here, not from the upper side, but from the inside where your work actually ends. So length is equal to width. You don't need to count. I hate counting. Okay, I'm going to make the first row and I will meet you at the end. All right, so I've made my first row. I'm starting to work back on the border and I'm almost done with the seed stitch. And I'm going to show you how to read your knitting. The first couple rows are going to be the hardest, and then it's going to be really obvious visually as you continue. So this first row, you can see popping up here. They were purl stitches when we did them. We flipped our work. So now we see knit stitches in front of us. So whatever you see in front of you, that's what you're going to do. So I see a bunch of knit stitches. Oops, let's put that stitch marker back on. I've reached a stitch marker, meaning I need to change. So I was doing seed stitch on the border. I've reached change point, so I'm going to do knit stitches for this first column section. And apologies if you hear my dog in the background. I'm going to do this until I get to my next stitch marker. And again, every time you reach a stitch marker, that's when you know you need a transition, which is why I love this pattern. Instead of having to count, oh, did I do 15 stitches? Did I do 16 stitches? Okay, I've reached a stitch marker. I've just done knit. which means purl is coming next. And you can see that second row made it more obvious that these are knit stitches in front of you. I slide my stitch marker over. And now we're going to switch our yarn to the front and we're going to make purl stitches. Until we reach the next stitch marker. And I'll show you one more transition to from the purl stitches to the knit stitches, and then I'm going to keep going. Okay, we've reached another stitch marker. Just going to slide it on our needles. You're going to transition to knit stitches, and you can confirm this by reading your knitting. This is all seed stitch, but if you pull your stitches, you can see that that one row, these are all knit stitches in front of you. So we're going to continue doing knit stitches for this section. All right, and how many rows do you do this for? Well, until you have a square. So same as we did for the border, where you just use your hand and measure the width versus the height. We're going to do the same thing for this intersection until we have a square. And I will reach that first transition and then I'll show it to you on camera so you know what you're looking for. But once again, for each of these guys, you can start to see the basket weaves forming, where you've got purl stitches here and you've got knit stitches here. And we just want our width to be the same as our height. So once I get about here, then I'm going to change again, and I'll show that to you on camera. But I have a lot of rows to go, so I'm going to make a cut now to the video. As you can see, I've gone ahead and finished that first section of the basket weave. And so you follow along with the pattern. We've just done this section here. The seed stitch bottom border is done. We've done a bit of the side, and we've done the first row of the basket weave. So now we need to switch. That means that since we have knit stitches here facing us, the square above it needs to be purl stitches. And then there's purl stitches here, which means the square above it needs to be knit stitches. We're going to do a quick check and make sure we have a square. Again, we're just measuring. The dimension itself does not matter. It's the fact that the width is going to be equal to the height. And check a couple of the squares just to make sure that you like that dimension and it's looking like a square to you. You can also count. So from here on out, I counted and I did 20 rows for this section. So I know that I need to do roughly 20 rows for the section above it. Ideally, your gauge is going to be consistent. And if you did 20 rows to get this square, you need to do 20 rows to get the square above it. Just pay attention as you go along. If you want to count that, go ahead and do it. If that makes you more comfortable that the end product will look the same. If not, you can keep doing just the quick hand measurement guide and your work will also look good at the end. I've gone ahead and done the seed stitches for the border off camera. And I've reached that first stitch marker. To continue doing this pattern where you have stockinette, this, if you see this here, this is called stockinette. I should keep making knit stitches. When I see a knit stitch in front of me, I should keep making knit stitches. However, I want this to be a basket weave and do squares. So this transition row, instead of making a knit stitch here, I'm going to make purl stitches. So I'm going to show you just this first square. That's all that you need to know for a basket weave. It's just knit stitches and purl stitches, and you transition when you want the basket weave to change. It can be a square, it can be a rectangle. There's really cool patterns that do all sorts of combinations. And we're almost to that next stitch marker. Okay, so I've done my last knit stitch, and I'm going to take and switch over. Oops, I dropped a stitch. My stitch marker, and I'm going to transition whatever I was doing before, so you can see those purl stitches showing up. So now we're going to start a new square here. Switch my yarn over. I was doing purl stitches now I'm going to do knit stitches, and that makes sense because I see purl stitches in front of me and I want to change to a new square. So I'm now going to do knit for this second square, and I'll show you the end of that square before I cut the video. But that's all that there is to this setup. And that's why I love this blanket, is because it's so easy. You're paying attention once every 20-ish rows, which is not hard to do. And I'm not counting stitches, which I love. So you can see that square, the stitches starting to change. You've got knit stitches in front of you. It's transitioning to a purl square above. This row is harder to see, but if you pull your stitches a little bit, you can see the V starting to form. And that's all that there is to it. So I'm going to do another section of this basket weave, and then I'll show you what that looks like and kind of speed up the progression as I make this blanket. This is a quick check-in for the progress of the knit baby blanket. As you can see, it's looking good. I've gone ahead and completed the second section of the basket weave, and that corresponds to this orange highlight on my graphic here. And I'll go ahead and proceed to the third section of the basket weave, and then I'll do another check-in. Section 3 of the basket weave is now complete, and the baby blanket is shaping up nicely. As you can see, you've got your 8 sections, and I'm going to go for a square, meaning 8 sections vertically as well. That corresponds to this blue highlight that I just did. And I'm curious to see if this amount of yarn will be enough for the 4th section of the basket weave, because that will be the halfway point of the blanket, and it will indicate to me whether or not 2 skeins of this yarn is enough to complete the blanket, or whether I do in fact need that 3rd skein of yarn. So I will check in when I get to the halfway point. This is one final check-in. I'm at the halfway point. I have 4 sections of the basket weave complete, and I do indeed have enough yarn left over so that I know that I only need 2 skeins of this particular yarn to finish my project. So I will go ahead and finish that, and I will meet you at the end when the blanket is complete, just so that I can show you the finished product. And here is the finished baby blanket. As you can see, the seed stitch created a nice border for our blanket all the way around. And some finishing touches. To cast off, I continued the seed stitch and then did the classic loop 1 over top, which is basically a single crochet stitch. But to continue that and make the edge look finished all the way around, after I cast off and reached the end of the row, I switched to a crochet hook and then single crocheted all the way around the other 3 sides of the border, just to give it a bit of stiffness and to make it look uniform on all of the edges. But if you don't crochet, then you could skip that stitch too. I just like the finished detail that it creates to make it look that much nicer. Now, our blanket is not perfectly square, and quite honestly, I don't care, because I like the ease of this pattern, and I want an even number of squares for the basket weave. That matters more to me than an exact square for a blanket. We're in the ballpark of the baby blanket dimensions, and that's all I care about. And there you have a basket weave blanket.